Welcome to the Empowered Christian Woman Podcast. My name is Jeanette Cochran. I'm a pastor, women's leadership coach, and self-proclaimed Jesus feminist. I'm on a mission to inspire and equip women everywhere to own our voice, speak up, create, and lead wherever God calls. Because when women rise, everyone wins. Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining me for another empowering conversation. Today I have another fantastic guest, Liz Coolidge Jenkins. She is a writer, a preacher, and a former campus minister. We talk about her new book, Nice Churchy Patriarchy, Reclaiming Women's Humanity from Evangelicalism. I read Liz's book when I was on vacation this year, and it resonated so deeply with me. A lot of her book is her memoir of her experience as a female leader on staff at a complementarian church. And just so many of the stories that she shared were not exact to what I've experienced, but very similar. And very similar to what I expect many female church leaders experience. And I think this is a really important book because Liz is trying to point out that even in churches that are what is often termed soft patriarchy or soft complementarian, meaning there are lots of things that women can do, but there are still a limited amount of rules and boundaries that women have to stay in because they are women, regardless of their gifts and their callings. Whenever we're even in those communities, it still hurts women and it hurts men, and everyone suffers. Because ultimately, even in those welcoming, nice churches, they are still suppressing women's possibilities and ultimately debilitating whole communities. They may be well-intentioned, but it still is negatively impacting our communities today and the future leaders of the church. And so I love the way through the stories that she tells, the subtleties and the nuances, how she shows that this is not really God's design. This is not really in alignment with who Jesus has called us to be and with bringing the church together as men and women, as partners in kingdom work, carrying on the mission that Jesus has called us to. So I really believe Liz is a bold voice calling for reform in the church. So I think you'll enjoy this conversation today. Sit back and welcome Liz Coolidge Jenkins. Liz, welcome to the podcast. You are the author of a book called Nice Churchy Patriarchy. I'm excited to dive into what's here in the book. But before we do, tell us a little bit about you and the work that you're doing.
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to meet you and talk with you and to be here. My name is Liz. A little bit about me. I grew up in the Seattle area in kind of a mainline, moderate kind of Presbyterian church, the kind where women are pastors and elders and nobody really feels the need to argue about it very much. And so it was a little bit of a shock for me when I moved to California for college. And during my freshman year at Stanford, I joined a different kind of church without quite knowing what I was getting into. So that was a more conservative, more evangelical church. And it didn't really occur to me at the time to ask very many questions about things like women in leadership. And so I very slowly discovered over the next year or two that women were not allowed to be elders. Women were not allowed to preach more than maybe once or twice a year. And that was just kind of this slow realization for me of, oh, like, what have I gotten into? How do I feel about this? And I actually spent the next 11 years in the Bay Area as a part of that church. And it was kind of this very, very slow journey of coming to realize all the different ways that patriarchy operated in that space and coming to recognize how not okay I was with those things. And so when I ended up attending seminary, that was kind of a chance to take a step back and think more about all of this, as well as other interconnected issues of justice and equity. So that's kind of part of my journey through those 11 years in that complementarian space, and then 3 years in an egalitarian kind of moderate evangelical seminary. And since then, I decided to put full-time effort into writing. And so I've, yeah, been working on a lot of things, including this book, Nice Churchy Patriarchy, and just unpacking a lot of that journey and reflecting on it kind of through the lens of feminist theology and feminist thought. That's kind of where I'm at.
I read the book on vacation this summer. And I have to tell you, Liz, like there were so many moments that I literally like just out loud was like, yes,
Mm,
amen, like just clapping because I've had similar experiences. So many of the
sure.
experiences that you've had, I've had them.
Yeah.
So it just resonated deeply with me. You put into words, like you not only gave the experiences that you had, but you did a really phenomenal job in each of those situations, helping people to understand the biases that are at play and the injustices and the difference in socialization. And I definitely have grown in my awakening as a Christian feminist. I was raised in a very conservative church. Feminist used to be a bad word.
Right, right.
It's now something that I claim honorably as a Jesus feminist because I believe that
Mm,
Jesus was.
yeah.
And but being in ministry some 25 years, a pastor for nearly 20 years, I see things so differently, even things that I didn't see in the past. And you point out some of those things that you realize you see differently, and why. And so it just makes me realize there's so much at play that
Yeah.
needs to be identified and uprooted, even in our egalitarian spaces. Because for the last
Um,
20 years, I have been in an egalitarian church, but we've been growing and I've been growing. And I can look back now on things that happened 10 years ago that I was totally fine with, that today I would realize that is not okay. And I need to
yeah.
speak up. So I love that you've written this book. And one of the things that I wonder is how did you stay at a complementarian church when you really had these egalitarian roots? Because mine was the opposite, but you had egalitarian roots, and yet you lived in this complementarian community for so long. What was
Yeah.
that like?
I think for me, when I first slowly kind of figured out what was going on at this church and that women were not fully welcomed into leadership and ministry in all its forms, I think I at first saw that as something that we could agree to disagree about. I don't think I ever fully bought into it. I do think that I held on to the egalitarian assumptions that I've been raised with and just came to hold those more strongly as time went on. At first, it felt like I can see where these people are coming from. I can see the verses that they're looking to in scripture. We share like a really high value for scripture and for taking it seriously and trying to follow what it says. Like it feels like we have more in common than the things that differentiate us. And I think that that was also very much the ethos of that community, right? Like that was kind of the assumption that people had that this is kind of a secondary issue of how women are treated or whether women are welcome and supported in ministry or not. People kind of thought, there's these things that unite us as Christians, and then there's these things that we can disagree about, and that's one of them. And so I think I did buy into that part of it for a long time, that it was okay that I had different views from some of the church leadership. It was okay that women were not fully honored or valued in that space. And so I think it was, yeah, a very gradual journey over those 11 years of coming to realize how not okay that was. And I think part of that was when I started working for the church, and I worked there full time for a couple of years leading the college ministry. And I think that was what was really eye-opening for me in terms of seeing what it was like to be not just a woman in that space, but a woman interested in and serving in ministry in that space. And I think that's where a lot of the more or less subtle forms of sexism really raised their heads and made themselves known to me in ways that weren't as obvious to me when that wasn't my work and my job.
I've often heard in complementarian circles and particularly in churches that would call themselves soft complementarian, that this is a secondary issue and we can
Yeah.
agree to disagree. I struggle with that these days because it subtly diminishes us down to we're just an issue. And I don't think it's intentional. I think that language of we can agree to disagree and it's a secondary issue is a way that Christians honor one another, let's stay in community, but it's a belief that significantly impacts half of the population. And I've also heard folks say it doesn't really matter what you believe here because people believe all different things. And so just be clear about what you believe and follow what you believe. And
Hmm.
that's just so interesting to me in this area because, especially in evangelical circles, like doctrine seems to be
Right.
really important. But
Yeah.
here they say it doesn't matter what you believe. And again, I come back to, but it does because what you believe impacts how you treat others, the actions that you take, whether we intend to have a negative impact or not, it does oftentimes have a very negative impact. So we're
Oh,
more than an
totally.
issue.
Yeah, right. Yeah, yeah. I get into that in the book a bit in terms of the way that these debates about women in ministry and gender roles in general would surface in my church community. And it often felt like this was a topic of conversation that could come up at any time and was kind of fair game for a casual church picnic conversation, or a more serious conversation among the church elders or leaders. And there was no warning for women who are kind of accosted by these conversations, right? And no recognition often that those conversations have a really different impact when it's about you, when it's about like my full humanity and whether or not my gifts are welcome here and whether or not I'm respected and honored in this space. Yeah, so I totally agree, not just an issue. And I wish that more men in these spaces would recognize that those debates about the issue of women in ministry are really conversations where it feels like the recognition of our full humanity is at stake. And it's not that we shouldn't be having conversations about these things. It's more that we need to recognize how draining and difficult they can be for women and kind of put some safeguards in place or kind of encourage women to make room for women to have more agency in these conversations and how they happen and whether or not we're expected to engage in them at any given time. And just kind of the terms of the debate, I think, are often really damaging to women and need to change. Hmm.
So, how did your view change over time? Like, what were some of the things that led you to what I understand eventually leave this faith community?
Um, Yeah, I think that what I came to realize over time was that it's not just about who can be an elder or who can preach, that the values and the theologies and ideologies that lie behind that trickle down into everything about the ways that people interact and the ways that people aren't respected or listened to. So I think for me, when I was first a part of this church community, it kind of felt like, well, I don't know if I particularly want to be a preacher at that point in my life, right? So I don't know if this really impacts me. But I think over time, I came to realize that, well, both that I did have some preaching gifts and I needed space to use them and communities that would encourage me in that. And also that even if I didn't have those gifts or those ambitions, that the reasoning behind not allowing women to take the pulpit really did trickle down into everything. And that churches that keep women from preaching and from leading really miss out on so many different perspectives and so many different gifts. And they really shoot themselves in the foot by, just kind of saying, no, we don't need the gifts of half of our community.
You tell this story in your book about a young man who came in as a pastor and apparently asked, he came into as a youth pastor and asked to be able to preach and kind of made it known
Oh,
that that this was something he aspired to be able to preach to the whole church. And then you later learned that he had asked, and you realized, how would I know that I could even ask for that?
Yeah.
In my journey of being a pastor for 20 years, when I first had the title of pastor, I was the first one at our church. I knew no women pastors. 20 years ago, we've come a long way. We still have so far to go. But when you think of where we were almost 20 years ago, I just hadn't seen it. And so I totally could relate to that idea of, I didn't even know that I could just ask for what I wanted. And then even a bit further, it took me so long to know what I wanted because there were not opportunities. And so you point
Right.
that out, that if young women are not given the opportunity to try out these gifts, how do we know that we have those gifts?
Yeah.
And so just the structural uh, inequities that leave women who have teaching gifts and callings, that either it takes them years and years to find them, or they don't ever find them because they're not really given those full opportunities to see what they could be.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, I would add too that I think sometimes we might tend to think of calling as this very individual thing or this purely spiritual thing. Like I heard from God at age 15 that I'm supposed to be a preacher. And maybe that's how it is for some people. And if so, that's great. But I think our senses of calling and gifting often come through community and through our gifts being recognized and encouraged by people in our communities and people in leadership. And so I think it matters what people in leadership are looking for and what kinds of gifts they are or aren't affirming and how those things are often gendered. So yeah, for me, part of how that really came into focus was when I had been working full time in college ministry at my church for a couple years. And I stepped down to part-time for a third year for a few different reasons that I go into more in the book. But the church ended up pretty quickly hiring another person in college ministry to work with me, which was great. He was just graduated from college. And after he'd been working there, I think maybe 2 months, the church invited him to preach at the Thanksgiving service. And so I think for me, my first reaction was like, oh, cool, great. Like, that's a great opportunity. He'll do a good job. And it took me a minute to realize that in the 2 years that I had been working there full time, nobody had invited me to do something like that. And it struck me as a little bit odd because during that time, I had been through the church's 2-year training program in ministry that included training in preaching, giving practice sermons to that group, right? I had really nothing but positive feedback from the leaders of the church on those practice sermons. And so I ended up going to my supervisor and just kind of gently asking, like sharing that observation that this opportunity was extended very quickly to this other person and that sort of opportunity had not been extended to me. To which my supervisor replied, oh, well, this person showed interest in preaching, and I don't think I've seen that same kind of interest from you. Which, technically speaking, was true. And technically, for him, I don't think it was necessarily consciously about gender. And yet, gender plays into all of this in ways that I was just coming to recognize. And I don't think that he would have recognized at all, right? Like the way that we assume we might be able to ask for things, like you said, or not ask for things. And for both me and my colleague who was asked to preach, our job was clearly in college ministry, right? So yeah, my assumptions were that I would be leading small groups with students and informally preaching to students, but not necessarily the whole church, and mentoring students and all that. And yeah, it definitely didn't occur to me to go to my supervisor and say, hey, I'd really like to preach to the whole church sometime. And I think that all that is wrapped up with gender, because even if I had expressed that kind of confidence and that kind of interest, those things that come across as ambitious are often seen really negatively in women. And I don't know that that would have been well received in this place where we're kind of all supposed to be humble and supposed to defer to others. And I think those things operate in some really nefarious gendered ways.
So interesting to see just, yeah, the stark difference and the unconscious biases. If it's not
Mhm.
done intentionally, it's certainly there unconsciously.
Yeah.
When you talk about the way that the actions can be viewed differently
Yeah.
based on gender, there's something else that you said in the book that I just thought was very profound, and that is so true. You talk about the Christian teaching, which is biblical, that we need to be humble, but this idea of diminishing ourselves so that Christ can come out more fully. And that can be internalized very differently for men and women.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I think that often when we talk about humility in Christian circles, we're totally missing that aspect of what humility looks like for different people, or what healthy humility looks like for different people in different social locations or with different amounts of power. And I think that the kind of community that Jesus wanted to build and still wants to build and is building is one where everybody is equal. Everybody operates as equals and everybody honors one another's full humanity and respects one another. And so I think that does require some kind of stepping back and some humility or some kind of deferring to others for those who have outsized power in a community. And then for those who are on the other side of those power structures, whether that's gender or race or sexuality or something else, stepping into that vision of equality and justice in a community often means stepping forward and owning the gifts that we have and the agency that we have. And yeah, kind of experiencing that and embracing that empowerment of kind of our worthiness and our value. Yeah, I think that when churches or pastors just kind of tell people to be humble or to decrease themselves, that Christ might increase across the board, they're not recognizing that that plays out very differently for the white male CEO, right? Versus for a woman, possibly especially a woman of color who does not have that kind of power in our society necessarily. And it can, telling people just to be humble across the board can actually increase those power differentials that are actually very ungodly, right? Like very unchristlike, not the kind of vision that I think Jesus is going for.
I coach women leaders, and a lot of them are women that have gifts and callings for church leadership or other ministries. And
Mm.
it's so common. I hear this again and again as women are wrestling with callings, that they almost always have some sense in the beginning of, is this just my pride? Or is
Mm.
this God? I have to figure this out. And
Yeah.
it's always interesting to me because in most of those situations, you can clearly see they're gifted. You can clearly see um, they they want to do something that is justice minded, that is going to make the world a better place. And yet they wrestle for a long time with, is this a prideful thing? And it makes me wonder
Mm.
how many male pastors wrestled for a long time
Right.
thinking it was prideful
Right.
to want to be a pastor and preach the gospel of Jesus. But
Right.
women, it's so not uncommon that that's there. And I think it's exactly because of what you said, because we don't see it enough. It feels, it is a boldness. You are stepping out, you're sharing your voice, you're being vulnerable. And so it feels like you're taking up a bigger space. You're
Mm.
being called into something bigger beyond yourself. And and I think because of our socialization and our teaching, we can spend a long time wondering, is this a prideful thing?
Yeah.
When it's totally the Spirit of God saying, I have something for you that is bigger than you.
Yeah.
And and I've given you the gifts to do it, and you just need the courage to step out. And so whenever I see that, I come alongside women and I'll listen really closely, but I look for those things like, is there the gifting? Is there the passion? Does this align with God's dream for the world? And if it does, I tell them to go. I'm like,
Yeah.
we all are going to need to develop our character. We're never going to arrive,
Yeah.
but all those things align with a calling. So get going and stop second guessing yourself.
Yeah, that's so good. And that's such powerful work to be able to say that to one another, that I see your gifts, I see what God's calling you into. We can encourage and empower one another to go for it, right? Especially because as women, we often face so much more pushback or criticism or doubts from others based on their patriarchal views, right? There's so much more we have to kind of work through. So I think it's really powerful when we can do that for one another, especially in a world, right, in a patriarchal world that often tries to pit women against each other or often makes room for one woman speaker at a conference or a church gathering or whatever, right? That we don't have to buy into that scarcity mindset or that mindset of competition. We can choose to believe that there's room for all of us and all of our gifts, and all of our gifts are needed, and that we all benefit when we can encourage one another in that way.
100%. That is an area that I've really tried to be very intentional in this season of my life. Wherever I can pour into other women, to not have an attitude of competition. If we believe, and we do, that the Spirit of God is at work transforming the world and moving us forward into a place where there's mutuality and men and women leading together, that's where it's going. There's room for all the gifts.
Going back to what you're saying about pride too, I mean, I often think of that in terms of spiritual gifts and what scripture tells us about how each person has gifts to offer. And so, yeah, I think it's not prideful to say I have gifts to offer, right? Because everybody does. It's not saying I'm the only person who has gifts to offer. It's not diminishing anybody else's gifts. It's not comparing or competing. It's just kind of owning who God made us to be and what God might be calling us to do.
That's such a good point. So let's talk a little bit about the ways in which we can connect with God in deeper ways and scripture by hearing from women. One of the things that I'm so passionate about is the need for the church to hear scripture preached from different voices, and especially diverse voices. So people of color, men and women, this model which most evangelicals churches have upheld for so long, there's one main teacher. No one person can have all of the revelations of God, number one, and they only have their view and their experience from their life. So I feel like when there are different voices, it's just a richness of understanding different facets of God. And women who have been left out of the pulpit for so long and still are in some churches, we're missing so much from the revelation of God. So talk a little bit about that. You do get into that a little bit in your book.
Yeah, I agree. We're missing out on so much. And I get into that in the book, both in terms of how women read scripture and how we need to be reading women theologians and hearing from women preachers. And we need to be hearing about the women in scripture. We need to be hearing from preachers who really see the women in the Bible stories and see them as fully human, not just as objects in somebody else's story or kind of bit players in God's story. We need to see how important they are. So I get into that a little bit, and also how I feel like reading female theologians and thinkers has helped me see God differently and see different aspects of who God is and what it might mean to see God as a mother and not just a father, and to see the ways that those images take shape in scripture, which I had ignored or not known about or just not really been told about for a long time, right? Like the ways that God is imagined as a birthing mother in the book of Isaiah, or as this kind of ferocious justice-seeking mother bear in the prophet Hosea, or even just Jesus comparing himself to a mother hen, kind of thinking about that more and how Jesus didn't have a problem with that. And what does that mean for us? Yeah, I think seeing how the attributes of God might take shape very differently, and the character of God and how we relate to God might be deepened by seeing that feminine side of God that's very much in scripture and in the experiences of so many Christians over the years, even if it's been kind of squelched out of modern day evangelicalism.
I agree so much. An example is just this Sunday, I preached at our church, and it was the first time I had preached in quite some time. And two things happened after. It was very well received, but there was a man in our church who I respect very much. He's a leader who came up to me and pulled me aside to just say how impactful the sermon was for him. He was expressing, you should teach more, like we need your voice. And what I realized again is it wasn't that the main teacher wasn't teaching well. It was that when I step up, because I'm a woman, he's a man, when I step up, I bring my life experience and what God is doing for me and from a feminine perspective. And that's going to come out differently. We could preach the same passage and we will preach it differently.
Yeah.
And so I so appreciated that he was willing to actually let me know that it touched him. The other thing that happened too, which you get on a little bit of this in the area of emotions, is he was really moved when he was speaking, and he was holding back tears. And he kept apologizing and holding back tears. And I said a couple of times, please don't apologize, because for those who know me, I am very expressive and I can cry at the drop of a hat, something that I'm passionate about, something that makes me happy. Tears flow easy for me. So I said, don't apologize. Like, me, I cry all the time. And then he reminded me, he said, yeah, but it's that toxic masculinity thing that we're not supposed to. And women are hurt when we're seen as overly emotional and emotions don't matter. And then the men are hurt too, because they don't have an outlet to express the normal, healthy emotions that God has given them. And it just, maybe this is partly why in some of our churches, we have such unhealthy leadership bubbling up, because these emotions are squelched and never dealt with. You touch on emotions and the way that they are gendered and seen differently in men versus women. What's been your experience with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a patriarchal system, as you said, women are associated with emotion and men are associated with rationality and the sense of not having emotions. Or often for men, the only kind of expected or acceptable emotion to express is anger, right? Like women are not supposed to be angry. Men are only supposed to be angry or not feel anything at all. And so, yeah, like you said, that is so damaging to everybody, both for women to repress those emotions and for men to only feel like they can express the more aggressive sides of their emotions, right? So yeah, I mean, I think whenever we get into these kind of gendered boxes of ways that men should be or ways that women should be, it damages everyone. Because God made all people in God's own image, right? Male and female in God's own image. And so, yeah, God is this very kind of not gendered, but also like multi-gendered or all gendered being who created us to embody different aspects of what our culture considers masculine or feminine. So I think it damages us as individuals when we feel like we're being boxed into some specific set of masculine or feminine attributes that really doesn't fit anybody very well. And then our communities also are so damaged when we're kind of aiming for that like pure rationality, when we're all kind of encouraged to leave our emotions at the door when we're making important decisions or when leadership teams meet, right? We're all kind of pretending that we don't bring emotions and intuitions to the table. I saw that a lot. Like when the leadership at previous churches would discuss their stances on different issues, it was all about, okay, what does the scripture say, right? What does historical Christian tradition, or at least one very specific stream of it, say? And I think that the way that those decisions or those theologies actually impact real people, this is kind of circling back to where we started out, really, was often downplayed as secondary. And that's kind of messed up, right? Like when our first commandment as Christians is to love God and love one another, like whatever feels like love and feels healing and healthful for people should be central, right? Like how things feel to people matters. And the intuitions that we have about things matter, and nobody really benefits when we pretend that we're just only these brains and not these hearts and guts and all the other parts of us.
So true. Liz, why did you write this book? What motivated you to write this book? Who is it for? What do you hope, if you have a vision for what it might do? Tell us a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote it because I was processing a ton of stuff, right? And this is very much my life for many years. And I came out of it with just a lot to think about and a lot that I felt like I was learning and seeing differently as time went on. And then in conversations with friends who had also been part of evangelical communities, I found that I was far from the only person thinking through all of these questions of gender and faith and patriarchy and the impact it has on people and how we might build something different. So I hope this book is encouraging for any women who think about these things, who've had frustrating experiences in churches. I think often, at least for me, like I kind of feel in my gut that something was off about that interaction or that thing that somebody said or that thing that happened. But I kind of need conversation and community and other resources to more fully think it through of like what was actually going on there and what was behind that. So I hope this book can help do that for people. And just, the whole second half of it is kind of about casting a vision for what Christian communities could be in a way that honors people of all genders as equals, and drawing on a lot of resources from seminary and other research that I've done to help us just imagine something different and kind of imagine something more whole and more beautiful together. So I hope it can help do that as well.
I believe it will. I was so encouraged, and I definitely encourage listeners to get your book. It's so interesting, so encouraging, and to share it with others. So if listeners want to find out more about you or get your book, where can they find you?
Yeah, the book is available anywhere online that you get books. Bookshop.org is especially nice because it supports local bookstores, but it's on Amazon too, or wherever you like. And then I'd love to stay connected with any of y'all on Instagram at Liz Coolidge, or via my blog at Substack. It's called Growing into Kinship.
Well, thank you, Liz. This has been fantastic. Thank you for being here. Thank you for using your gifts and for showing us what Christian community could be, should be, and what we can aspire to and how we can be better on our journey together. So I just appreciate your work, and I'm so grateful that you were here today.
Thank you. I'm so grateful for this conversation. Thank you.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Empowered Christian Woman Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and share it with other women in your network. For more information about me and the work that I do, check out JeanetteCochran.com. And I'd love to hear from you personally. Come join the conversation on social. You can find me on Facebook at J. Cochran Coach or Instagram at Jeanette.Cochran.